Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Over the course of this global pandemic in which various forms of isolation has now become the new norm, it's critical that we continue to organise in our communities to overcome these challenges. And that's why Dunn Street has partnered with organisations across Australia and the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise in their local communities. So in 2020, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire and give hope to others and to build communities from the ground up. And to find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, you can hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. I've also been thinking about doing sponsorship reads from just random companies that I have no connection with whatsoever, like Dunkin' Donuts. I've watched that much Red Sox baseball over the years. I pretty much know every sponsorship read that they do during the game, like Amica Insurance, Auto, Home and Life. But I won't, and I digress. Speaking of America, on today's episode of Socially Democratic, your favourite weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast, we've got Sam Schneidman back on the show today to talk about the US presidential elections. We're not talking about the primaries anymore because they're done. We finished with that, and now we're moving on to the general between the Trump and our man Joe Biden. So Sam's going to be on today to talk a bit about the campaign ahead, how it's going to be a little bit different because of the restrictions placed on people in the states at the moment. We're going to talk a bit about digital organising. We're going to talk a little bit about what the battleground states will be, where the race can be won and lost, just to sort of whet our appetite as we get closer and closer to November. And don't forget, if you want more updates on all of the things that are related to Socially Democratic or Dunn Street in general, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. That is, follow Dunn Street on those social media platforms. And subscribe to Socially Democratic on your favourite podcast app. Could be Apple Podcasts, could be Spotify, Stitcher. And if you are on Apple Podcasts, can you please leave us a review and give us a rating? So let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Thursday lunchtime in desolate Melbourne CBD. And it's been a while since we have had our good friend Sam Schneidman on the podcast. He has gone into big-time lockdown hibernation, and not much has happened really in the world of Democratic primary politics for a while there. But obviously we have had a primary in Wisconsin and then a bunch of announcements by various candidates, which has sort of brought the primary season to a conclusion. So we thought it would be a great time to get Sam back on the line. And he is on the line, but he's not in Brooklyn, New York. Sam, welcome back to Socially Democratic. How are you?
I'm good, mate. Thanks for having me back.
Where are you right now? And how is your health?
Physically, I seem to be healthy and safe, so I'm thankful for that. Mentally, I think I'm as scattered as anyone who's been enduring quarantine for the last couple months. I'm in Leicester, Vermont, which is even more desolate than whatever Melbourne's CBD appears to be at the time. And I'm in this, little farm community up in the heart of Bernie country trying to ride it out.
You're in New England, kid. Good for you.
Yes, I am.
You go down to the Packy, get a sixer, Sam.
No, I'm not that into it. I'm more on sort of like the isolated, solitary part of the New England brand.
Okay, you're not watching Nesson and catching some old Sox games from Fenway Park? You're not doing that, kid?
No. I think like one of the paradoxes of our new time is that, we've never been more connected, and somehow we're like even busier than we've ever been, I think, as people. Some are who are lucky to still be employed.
In all seriousness, and just dropping my really shit New England accent for one moment, and we will obviously we'll dive into the politics of the Democratic primaries and turning our attention to the general in a moment, but just on the ground in, I mean, it's, as you said, it's hard to sort of get a sense of what people think because you are also isolated, but you're certainly a lot more closer to the real impact of coronavirus in the United States than we are over here in Australia. What's your read on it since we last spoke?
I think when we last spoke, I was trying to get my mind around what was truly happening. I think that, we were able to sort of perceive the scale of this crisis, at least in New York, but it was kind of hard to accept what that new reality would become on the other side of this. And now we are firmly in that new reality, and that sort of struggle to grapple with what was happening has now come into, I think, like this sense of resignation of a new, unchosen future. And I can't speak for everybody, but personally speaking, I'm quite frustrated with the way our federal government has handled this. A total lack of strategic planning and central coordination to marshal resources, get everybody on the same page. I think that has contributed to more deaths. I think it's contributed to a higher than necessary infection rate. And I think that it has put more people in danger over the long term in terms of their exposure to this virus.
When I look at the numbers, September 11 and the moment those two planes hit the Twin Towers in New York, that really reshaped not just American politics and an American society, but it also reshaped the global politics and global society and how we all interrelate with each other. I think that anyone who is alive and of age that can remembers those moments, where they were and what was happening when September 11 occurred. And one of the biggest impacts immediately from it is just the number of people that died on that day. It was I think it was 3,500 in New York alone.
No, it was total.
In total, right.
Yeah.
So including the Pentagon and obviously the folks on the aircraft that crashed in Pennsylvania. The death toll of this coronavirus for New York alone has well and truly exceeded that number. There was an interesting article by Ben Rhodes a couple of weeks back as the fatalities ticked over that September 11 and said, "This is our new. We can't refer to ourselves as living in a post-September 11 America now. We need to refer to ourselves as living in a post-corona." Well, not even post, but it will be a redefining of American politics. Do you feel that is taking place right now? Are people is there a self-awareness of the impact that this is actually having on not just people in New York, but across all 50 states? Because it seems patchy in terms of the way that people are responding to it.
Yeah, I think time will tell. Ultimately, I believe that the comparison of this experience with coronavirus and 9/11 is not necessarily apt. Both are shocking, but in their own way. 9/11 sort of unfolded seemingly instantly. It was televisual. Everyone was watching it in real time and seeing what was happening. And our interaction with coronavirus is a little bit slower in the way that it's come to the forefront of society. We don't necessarily. It's harder to pin who we can blame for this, and there is debate and talk about whether this came out of a lab in China and to what extent China is responsible. There'll be plenty of time for that discussion. But I think it's a little bit harder for us as individuals, as communities, as countries to pin the blame for a virus on a set of actors. And another thing about 9/11 is that it was a deliberate, conscious act. People made a choice to attack the United States of America. And when people choose to attack you, especially for political reasons, that gives you a strong foot to fall back on. And viruses are, they don't care what your border is, what your nationality is, what your politics are. And I think, we're sort of trying to come to grips with that. Now, where I think I am hopeful is that, we went through the shock of World War I, and then the Spanish influenza sort of contemporaneous with the end going through 1920. And then we went through the shock of the Great Depression into World War II. And after both of those experiences, we emerged with, at least in the United States, a stronger society that was more economically balanced. People after after World War II, we got things like the GI Bill. Eventually, we got Medicare and Medicaid, a few decades on from that. We got people wanted federally subsidized mortgages. So there was a clamoring after this sense of shared sacrifice for a broader social contract. And what we are going through, at least in the United States, is a real test on whether we can go through a shared sacrifice and emerge as a stronger country. And, ideally, you have a strong, competent, and capable leader to get you through that. And I think that, if anything, is the defining part of this experience, is a totally inept president and Congress.
That's a good segue into talking about how you can change who that president is in November. And before we do that, can we just recap, since we last spoke on the podcast, about the Democratic primaries? It was immediately following the primaries, which were held on the Feast of St. Patrick, 17th of March, that included Illinois, Ohio, Florida, and Arizona, from memory. Bernie Sanders loses substantially across all of those states. We talked about that and broke that down, and we were sort of starting to ask the question, how does Bernie stay in the race? Surprisingly, he doesn't suspend his campaign following those primary losses.
I wouldn't read too much into that, honestly. I think, he has, done so in formality and is continuing to stay in to influence the platform, continue to push Joe Biden. And, he's not sort of like running a shadow campaign or anything like that.
No, I say surprisingly just because I kind of thought it would wrap up a lot quicker. And watching the way that a lot of Democratic surrogates and strategists commentary in the media, they didn't seem overly stressed. I feel like a lot of things were going on in the background to let Bernie just not rush him into making this decision, but there was enough indicators out there in terms of what of his fundraising efforts and whatnot. And also the fact that the coronavirus pandemic was really starting to escalate at that time as well, and he seemed to be putting a lot of his efforts as a legislator into trying to deliver some good outcomes for working people as well. So, yes, that point taken. Then, just to recap, a number of primaries were rescheduled to deal with the fact that coronavirus and the social distancing and lockdowns were happening across states. So, and that included the moving of the Arkansas, Wyoming, Louisiana, and Hawaiian primaries. Both campaigns both going to hibernation and shift whatever activities they were doing in terms of voter contact effort to online and phone banking from home. Weirdly enough, 7th of April, the Wisconsin primary is forced to go ahead by the Supreme Court. We'll come back to that and get your thoughts on that at some point. Joe Biden wins quite substantially. Then Bernie finally suspends his campaign. Bernie endorses Biden's campaign. Obama then comes out and endorses Biden's campaign. Elizabeth Warren comes out and endorses Biden's campaign. And for the first time since 2004, we have a Democratic nominee as early as March. That brings us up to basically where we are today, in which we can now turn our attention to the general election campaign between young Joe Biden and old man Trump. But before we do that, how do you, upon reflection, how do you think history will treat Bernie Sanders and his 2 attempts at seeking the nomination to be the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, a party I will point out that he is not a member of? Sorry, I had to do one dig there. How do you think history will treat Bernie?
I think any objective measure of Bernie Sanders will have to be positive. And let's just look at the facts. I mean, he was clear even back in 2016 about why he was getting in the race. And from memory, it was basically for 2 reasons. One was to push the Democratic Party and the conversation into a more progressive direction. And it was to highlight the concerns of middle and working class people and to be a champion for them that they hadn't really had in a prominent way, it seemed, over the last several decades of politics, in a way that really channeled that anger and channeled the emotion of what it's like to be a member of that social class. And so I think when you look at his sort of involvement in politics over especially the last 10 years, and you sort of, base it off what he was trying to achieve, it has to have been successful. I mean, if you think about it this way, a $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all, the elimination of student debt, putting climate change forward as one of the most important issue that we deal with as a society. These are all mainstream policies, at least within the Democratic side of politics right now. Every single frontrunner for the Democratic nomination, except Joe Biden, supported elements of that agenda, whether it be, well, I guess Joe Biden also probably did. It's, he doesn't support Medicare for all or, the Green New Deal or, and eliminating student debt, but aspects of that were all, every sort of not candidate in 2020 was supporting that stuff. And that's not going away. And I think if you also look at building sort of the capacity of the Democratic Party and the next generation of activists and candidates, it would be really interesting to see how influential, Bernie Sanders is to those forthcoming leaders and emerging leaders compared to even, say, Barack Obama. I think I'm not saying that Bernie was, more significant than Obama, but I'm saying that he has done a lot as an individual to move the conversation and in a more progressive direction and achieve the objectives that he set out to achieve.
Now that we have a Democratic nominee so early in the primary season calendar, I just want to get your thoughts on the importance of party unity. You're sort of reading a lot about this in the media at the moment, and perhaps for the folks at home to give some sort of context of the lack of party unity that has plagued previous primary seasons. And I'm speaking of the 2008 primary season for the Democratic Party and 2016. With Bernie not only suspending his campaign so early in the calendar and also so quickly coming out and endorsing Biden, as opposed to what's happened in previous ones. I look at the last time we actually had a primary season wrap up so quickly was 2004 with John Kerry. How united do you think the Democratic Party is now, and how important is that if it is the case?
Well, I think, on paper, the Democratic Party is pretty united. The top levels of it certainly are. But I think, at least in 2020, party unity is in the eye of the beholder. I think it would be revisionist history to say in 2016 that the Republican Party was unified behind Donald Trump. So I think since this will be our first like truly online election, I'd be concerned if I were the Biden campaign about the dissension specifically within the left online. Now, there is a whole saying about how like Twitter is not real life and things of that nature. But what would give me pause on the Biden campaign is that there is some continuing dissension, especially among Bernie prominent Bernie supporters and campaign alumni who have large followings and are influential and have quick access to media, which will pick up their message and amplify it. The media really wants to push that storyline of dissension within the Democratic Party and Bernie people not lining up behind Biden. And, that's just an objective pattern that we see. And, that's still very much a thing. And so while the top level of party unity, or while the top level of the Democratic Party appears to be very unified, I'd be concerned about especially some of the dissension in the grassroots online. Now, here is why this matters, because in the past, party unity has been really important for fundraising, especially. Each candidate would be able to get their big dollar fundraisers behind the eventual nominee, and that results in this big pool of cash that can then be used to get the nominee over the hump who can carry all these down ballot races. That dynamic doesn't exist anymore. And what I think candidates really have to rely on going forward is the ability to disseminate their message online, because the message, more than anything, is going to be what drives fundraising and the sense of momentum now. And so that is something that sticks out to me as a red flag. I think it's important that optically the party is unified up top, but we will see over the coming months how significant it is that there appears to be some squeaky wheels on the internet.
We'll talk about moving campaigns to the online space a little bit later. And before we do that, I just want to get a sense from you about the actual sort of top line general observations of the contest between Biden and Trump. It's 194 days till election day. What do you perceive as the battleground states that are crucial for a Biden victory in November?
Well, I think it's going to be sort of old faithful there. It's going to be Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Florida, and Pennsylvania. And we're going to see whether or not Biden has what it takes to sort of carry those. But if I look at some of the fundamentals of his campaign and what's going to matter in this election, does he have the reach online? Does he have the mass appeal? I don't think he has what it takes to sort of push the map, expand the electorate, or expand the map in states like what I would call frontier swing states, Arizona, North Carolina, Texas even. So I think it's going to continue to be a tight election, and it's going to come down to those four that are going to be most significant, which are Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Florida, and Pennsylvania.
And in terms of the sort of the messaging and policy frame, how should Biden be framing up Trump in the early days of this campaign, particularly given that what's going on right now in the country and the thing that's taking everyone's attention, that is the coronavirus?
That's a really good question. Trump sort of built himself up as someone who was going to fight for this sort of forgotten class of people. And I think, the most effective way to sort of cut Trump down to size is to point him out that he sold you out. he only cares about sort of like the rich people in this country, at least with the policies that he's pursued. If you look at things such, his only major legislative accomplishment, the only one, was that tax bill that he passed back in 2017, where sort of like 90% of the benefits of that bill went to the top 1% of holders of wealth in the United States. He has been trying to dismantle health insurance in this country as we know it. His administration has filed lawsuits to get rid of the Affordable Care Act in its entirety, which, among other things, was particularly significant because it's the first time ever that an insurance company has not been able to deny you coverage for pre-existing conditions. Things such as high blood pressure, high cholesterol, family history, even being a woman. These are all things that counted as pre-existing conditions. So he has pursued policies that have sold people out in this country and have benefited only the wealthiest among us. And the next thing that I think you have to point out in a very clear way is he's a horrible deal maker. Every single deal that he has seemed to blow up in his face and has made America weaker. And then another thing that I think we need to really realize as a country is that we are fully isolated in the international community, and that matters. We don't have the influence that we have had throughout presidencies of both parties, and we have never been more impotent geopolitically ever. But I think what it really comes down to is that he really has sold people out, and he's way in over his head, has no idea what he's doing. And unfortunately, what we're living through with the coronavirus pandemic is bringing that into relief.
It's a really weird position that I find Trump in at the moment, because in 2016 he positioned himself as a clear outsider candidate, the anti-establishment candidate, and spoke to a lot of the concerns at that time amongst the electorate that were losing faith in the establishment and in bodies and entities, including government, that once we trusted. And there's a bit of research into that, at that time in 2016, people had less faith in establishments and government than ever before. But now, fast forward to 2020, and this was written about at some point when people were looking for glimmers of hope in sort of 2017. They were saying, well, he framed himself as a person who was the outsider, but by 2020 he will be a person who will be owning a lot of the things that he had done as the man that sits in the White House, and that he is now the establishment. But right now, it seems to be that he's trying to play both sides of the road, because every day he's giving daily coronavirus briefings in the White House, standing next to medical experts, directing everyone to stay at home. But at the same time, he's also tweeting to his base, calling on to liberate Virginia, Michigan, and Minnesota. How can he successfully disown the responsibilities of his own administration's slow and costly response to the spread of the virus? Do you think he's going to have the ability, the agility more so, to play both sides of the street, to both be anti-establishment but also at the same time, be the guy that's in the White House? Can he pull that off?
Time will tell. And I wish I had a better answer for you. I think it's really hard for me to look at the facts, to look at what we have been living through, and to say that this has been good, to say in any way that he should continue to be in charge. It is objectively awful. It's bad. And time will tell whether or not he's going to be held to account for that at the ballot box. But I can tell you that I don't think it's going to be the body count that's going to be what gets him in, what is going to be what gets him in trouble with voters, sadly. I think it's going to be the cumulative cost of this whole experience. it's going to be the loss of loved ones that we feel, and Democrats, Republicans, we've all lost people to this virus, and it's affecting us in very, very real ways. And then, I think it's also separated us from sort of what gives us purpose in this country. And it's the ability to have community, to go to work, to make an honest living, and have an identity for yourself based on like what you do and how you contribute. And, the longer we are cut off from that, I think the more frustration there will be in his inability to give us hope that we're going to get out of this. I think we as a country understand that he is not responsible for the virus existing and for the virus being present in this country. Like, it was always going to come here. I think where we get frustrated is that we have been slow-footed to respond to this. We have fared far worse than any other country on the planet. And that's just an objective fact. And that undercuts directly his jingoistic machismo, America first, we're the greatest in the world. And the longer we go through this, and if there is not a quick rebound economically, and if there is not it comes back worse in the fall and winter, I think there will be real frustration with him. And so that's why I think it's really important for Biden and the Democrats to really say how much he has sold the people out of this country.
Yeah, it's if you were to look at a campaign and set it up for an election victory for a social democratic party or a centre-left party, all of the ingredients are, I think, ready to walk in a win in a textbook scenario. And I know that
I think I would just push back on that in the sense that the textbook doesn't exist anymore. It's an old volume.
Yeah,
we're in totally uncharted territory.
Yeah, absolutely.
And your question was, not to Sam splain to you, Stephen, but your question was, can he successfully disown responsibility for this? I think when you look at this, what's interesting about this being a online election is that more than ever, the media environment really matters. And so far, Trump has been able to get endless free coverage day after day, just like in 2016, of these cable news channels covering him every single day, where he gets to spout off disinformation, bully reporters, disown facts and decisions that he's made, and divert.
And in some cases, literally in one press conference.
Slide.
Yeah, I saw, there was one where he said one fact and then 10 minutes later claimed that he didn't say that. It's amazing. Like, normally he waits 2 or 3 days before he makes up new bullshit, but he was actually doing it physically in the same day.
And so this is why that matters, is because millions of people see this in real time. And then from there, it gets sort of chopped up online and recycled through these online communities on various platforms. And, that feeds into the conversations that people have offline and into this broader narrative. And it becomes sort of this mimetic phenomenon. And that is what I think is truly fascinating about this. It's a totally asymmetrical information environment that we're dealing with. And so if Trump has anything going for him, it's the fact that he is able to command endless amounts of attention from traditional media and then the unique ways that traditional media feeds online information consumption habits.
So we've spoken a bit about Trump and the strengths and weaknesses of his campaign going into the election proper. Let's turn our attention to Biden, and let's start by, and I know we're going to talk more about sort of online campaigning here, but let's talk about the strengths of the Biden campaign as we stand right now. What are the assets that Joe's got going for him?
Well, I think it's really important to talk about first what he doesn't have going for him.
No, that wasn't my question. I'm forcing you to say some good positive things about Joe Biden before we go into talk about what are his weaknesses.
I will get there.
All right, fair enough. Go for
it. The reason why I'm going to start off by what he doesn't have for him is because I think it's far more significant than what he does have going for him. What he does not have going for him is scale. So traditionally, you've been able to buy scale, right, online or within like media first campaigns. You've been able to buy it just by pouring hundreds of millions, billions of dollars into buying TV commercials, radio commercials, whatever. Now you can't do that as much. And so his reach is considerably smaller than Trump's. He's got around like 6 million followers across all the major online platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Trump has over 100 million. So he's got more than 12 times the reach of Biden. You know, it's kind of like crazy.
But anyone that was going to go up against Trump was always going to have a deficit in that respect.
True, but they had a broader reach than Biden. And beyond that, Biden is in the hole several hundreds of millions of dollars. Like Trump has him beat by $137 million online, or just in terms of cash and fundraising, which allows him to buy more effective ads online because they're cheaper, and they're cheaper because his ads generate more engagement. Now, Trump also has this thing where he incites a visceral reaction online of anybody, right? And the way that our online platforms exist is that they sort of reward this sort of like tribal sort of feeling that we have, and we react very strongly to things, and the more strongly that we react to things, the wider something is disseminated. If Biden has anything going for him, it is the fact that he's very famous. And his fame, the fact that he's been around for a really long time, will enable him to overcome those very real and structural disadvantages in a way that someone like Pete couldn't, like Mayor Pete, right? Or Amy Klobuchar or Kamala Harris. I think another thing that he has going for him is that he appears to be a very safe choice. You know, I think when people, make America great again sort of is this call to some like time or some past that maybe never even really existed. And I think it's not hard to see Biden outside of that past that maybe we're trying to reclaim, and people feel sort of comfortable with that. And maybe that's what he had going for him over Bernie Sanders, is that people feel more comfortable with him. And so I think if he's going to overcome Trump, it's not necessarily going to be because of his message or a superior campaign that he's run. I think it may have to do with the fact that, he just is at the right place at finally the right time.
Mm. So it would be fair to say that if you're the campaign manager for either of the two campaigns and you're trying to work out what your campaign looks like leading into November, you're going to have to make contingency plans that are operating under the assumption that the restrictions that are currently in place, certainly in the states that are battleground states, that those restrictions or some form of restriction will remain in place for a large part of the calendar year remaining. We may get to a stage in October, November where people physically can, be in more public spaces. But certainly you'd say so we're in April now, May, June, July. You'd imagine for the next 2 or 3 months that these strict restrictions are going to remain in place. So therefore, it's going to be difficult for the candidates
I think what you're actually likely to see, at least in the United States, Stephen, is, an uneven approach. And some states are going to open up more liberally and fully than others. And that's going to accelerate the spread of this virus. And so I think what we're going to really be experiencing is this peak and valley sort of experience heading into the fall, where we think that we're out of the woods, but then it proves that we're not.
Yeah.
And then I think you layer on top of this the fact that we don't have the scale of testing that is truly required from a public health standpoint to contain this. It's going to be really stressful and hard.
But what I was trying to get to was that if you're the campaign manager, you're going to have to make adjustments to your campaign from a traditional campaign playbook. You won't be able to.
There's going to be no 4th of July parades.
Yeah.
You're not going to be you're not flying door knocking.
You're not flying the candidates around to do rallies and then do follow-ups, sort of speech announcements and that kind of stuff. So a lot of it, as you said, is going to move.
And maybe that benefits Biden.
Well, that's right. I want to get your thoughts on that. So you move to a campaign, certainly for the next 2 or 3 months, that are predominantly online. How do you get your candidate? How do you get Joe media time? How do you front foot your announcements? How do you disseminate that message out and replace, canvassing, traditional sort of door knocks with other forms of direct voter contact? Talk us through the ways in which you would look to run a campaign that is more digitally focused with a candidate than you would normally do.
So that's a really, really good question. And I think, just going back to something that you said just at the start of that is, maybe, candidates aren't doing big rallies and they're not really, sort of in front of a lot of people. And maybe that's actually a benefit to Biden because that exposes Trump. And the more Trump becomes exposed and associated with this awful virus, people just get pissed and want to get him out of there. I think, look, let's talk about how it's different. For me, in the most fundamental way that is different is that it's harder to model the outcome of a truly online campaign. The data that you're going to generate from voter contact is probably not as reliable. It's harder to predict voter patterns because you can't do any sort of voter contact. So it's going to be harder to model, I think. Now, I think, why is it important that this is sort of a digital first campaign? Why is it important that this is a fully online election? I think, it's the 80s all over again in the sense that it's fully a media campaign. It's going to be battled out totally. I think there's the main battle is going to be fought in the arena of information. And, you're not really going to be able to rely on that 3 to 5% bump from voter contact that you would normally. And this is important because we don't know how it's going to affect down ballot races. Organizing has been important to get candidates over the hump, for sure. But there's this follow-on effect of helping out people who are running for Senate or state assembly. And this is particularly important in 2020 because it's a census year. And what they do in the United States every year after the census is taken is redraw state legislature boundaries. And these state legislature boundaries sort of determine the partisan composition of that state's legislature, and they also determine the proportion of voters that sort of go towards traditionally Republican congressional districts and Democratic congressional districts. So it's highly consequential. And then fundraising is going to be really important, but not in the way that we traditionally understand it. So the way that campaigns are fought in the United States, at least when it comes to fundraising, it's who can build the biggest war chest. And that's important because historically, if you've been able to build like a huge war chest, you've been able to sort of like run all these TV ads. But the reason why it's important here is because you're able to sort of flood all these social media platforms with ads and really disseminate your message that way. So I think to the extent that Biden's online campaign will differ from Trump's, it's going to be smaller scale. And fundraising is going to be way smaller because his content is going to generate less reaction, and therefore his message is going to get out less, and people are going to be less excited to donate.
How much can we read into the most recent primary and elections that were held in Wisconsin in early April? Obviously, there was the primary that existed between Smoke and Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. But there was also other elections taking place for local government elections in Wisconsin between Republicans and Democrats. And that was part of the reason why the Republican, Wisconsin's a Democratic state legislator in which they were trying to extend what's referred to in the US, you call them mail-in ballots. In Australia, we just call them postal voting. But they were trying to extend the postal voting timeline for folks to send in their ballots out to sort of later April to give people an opportunity to actually cast their vote because of the fact that the state was in lockdown. And it was it was then sent to the US Supreme Court and was overturned by along partisan lines that forced people to either go out and vote and break these sort of curfews. And there was the politics behind it is that there was actually an election for, correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, but I think there was a Republican who was running for their local court.
No, it was a state Supreme Court.
Supreme Court, that's right.
Yeah.
So they wanted
States.
They wanted to get their guy up, and they thought by forcing people they thought that extending the balloting time for mail-in ballots would help the Democrats to enforce a turnout election, but it backfired, and the Democrats won. Is the Wisconsin primary, or is this election in Wisconsin a bit of a window into what we can see in terms of campaign infrastructure replicated for the Republicans and the Democrats in November?
Well, I would say for Democrats it should be encouraging, and then I would draw a hard stop right there. It should be encouraging, but here's where I would sort of qualify that. It was a total protest election. Now, it was a presidential primary. Trump was not on the primary. He's not being primaried. It was drawing Democrats out. And then there was this drama that literally played out the day before the election that was really easy to sort of spin as GOP trying to prevent Democratic turnout. And because it was a total protest election, that means the limitation is that this was an election for the total diehards, people who really wanted to sort of like be involved in choosing a Democratic nominee or sort of like vote for the state Supreme Court seat. So it's hard to see the term that's used is the mushy middle. We don't necessarily, this isn't a clear eye into where the full electorate is sitting. What I think should be encouraging is that there is enough motivation among Democratic voters to go out there and just get this done, to just turn out and vote and get people over the top. Now, whether or not there were some very unique circumstances that contributed to the Democrats winning in that election. So it's really hard to extrapolate those results and transpose them on the election in November.
Well, we've got another 190 odd days to ponder and discuss and dissect this campaign. We certainly appreciate your time this evening over in New England and Vermont to talk to us today about the forthcoming election. I know we're going to get you back on again in the weeks and the months to come, but it's a start. We've now got two. It's down to two people: red versus blue, GOP versus Democrat, old versus new. And I look forward to hearing your very rosy, glass half full viewpoints about the Biden campaign in the coming weeks and months.
Well, he's going to have to top up my glass. Let's just put it that way.
Oh, I didn't pick that up at all in the last 50 minutes.
If I'm going to give you the glass half full, look, I mean,
dude, we're looking for hope here, man. Come on.
I know. I'll say this, Stephen. You know, I'm going to vote for him. Clearly, I'm going to sort of do what I can.
Clearly, you're going to end up in Nevada again, running another campaign.
What's that?
I said, clearly, you're going to end up in Nevada again.
Yeah. I think another thing that he has to his benefit is that, over the past several years, Democratic candidates have been building up this sort of digital organizing infrastructure that is, we haven't talked about it in this conversation, but it's a really important detail. And, I think the Democrats have an outreach infrastructure to really do persuasion online. And we're going to begin to see, whether or not that sort of direct voter contact traditionally, which is door knocking and calling people on the phone, has been really important for this whole idea of what we call list building. And that means you're able to sort of understand list building is okay, I've got this many supporters, and based on my conversations, my opponent has that many supporters. But now we're finally going to be able to have the ability to sort of not only do list building, but also potentially some persuasive voter contact. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not Biden is able to sort of marshal the resources that have come up from the bottom-up aspect of the Democratic Party through various campaigns, be it Bernie's campaign, Beto O'Rourke's campaign in 2018 was very influential in this. Can Biden, is he as a person, as a leader of his campaign and party, sort of attuned to this dynamic enough to marshal those resources? That's a really key question. Well, I'm not, I think time will tell. Biden was on the ropes for a long, long time in that primary and sort of squeaked it out. And so, we will see whether he's able to sort of drum up some genuine enthusiasm. I think any successful campaign has to be able to draw an effective contrast from their opponent. So far, amidst the coronavirus pandemic, you cannot say that Joe Biden has been drawing that contrast. If anyone has been drawing the contrast between Trump and Biden, it has been Trump. Now, whether that will come out to be Trump's benefit, that is the question. So we'll see how this turns out.
Well, we'll have to organise another time in the coming weeks to just check in with you and see how things are going. Like I said before, we do appreciate your time. So much more to talk about in this campaign, both from an organising standpoint and from messaging and fundraising and everything else that goes into what is a fascinating election process. Thanks very much, Sam, for coming on today's episode. Look after yourself and your family and your friends, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot. It's always good to chat with you, and my best to everyone down there in Australia as you guys battle coronavirus as well.
Cheers.